Here we go. Season 7.
All aboard!
If you missed it, here's what we believe. 66 book canon. We believe in a 66 book canon. There is no more, there is no less. It's 66 books.
That Yeshua, who is preached by the apostles in the Gospels and in the epistles, is the only means of salvation, as we would call him, Yeshua means.
In other words, justification is by faith alone and not by works that any man should boast.
Faith working through love.
We are unashamedly Trinitarian. We're also unashamedly believe in the doctrines of grace, what is commonly referred to as Calvinistic.
The new covenant is not time bound. That is to say that the horizon of the faith of our father Abraham is no different.
Right.
It is not shy of the horizon of our hope and our faith.
In other words, that salvation was the same for Abraham as it is for us.
Right.
It is Wednesday, August 5th, 2020. This is Messiah Matters number 309, officially part of the Kraken crew. I'm proud of it. Crew. My name is Caleb Haig.
Is that what they call it's the Kraken crew?
That's what we call it.
Drinking ice water from one of these straw-free cups to save the turtles. Although it spills over me every time I drink it. I'm Rob Vanoff.
I love how your introductions are usually just something that you are doing at your desk at the time because you haven't put any thought into it.
I live in the now. I live in the moment.
Oh, man. Yeah.
I live in the now, man.
Seattle Kraken, baby. Seattle Kraken.
Get cracking. Let's get cracking.
Kraken crew, Squid Squad. That's another one.
The Squid Squad.
The Squid Squad. Our opponents, I'm sure, will call us crackheads. That's fine.
Nice.
I don't care. It's fine. It is what it is.
You can embrace that one.
Oh, there's a lot of people.
Do they have those foam like Kraken heads that people will wear?
Dude, the merchandise is off the chain. We don't talk about politics and we don't talk about sports on this show. However, that's about to change. The Seattle Kraken have beaten the franchise expansion record for merchandise sold. By the previous record holders were the Vegas Knights. We have outsold them 4 times over. 4 times. So, it is what it is. Okay. What up, everybody? How's it going? Welcome to the show, especially those in the chat room. Here are our associate and executive producers. Thank you so much to them for helping produce this show. It is greatly appreciated. We have put an extra video in the Messiah Matters More section, so go check that out. And you can also support this show for as little as $5 a month and then have access to that page, Messiah Matters More. And, see all of our fun extra videos, which are never published anywhere else. Mm-hmm. All right. We've had a lot of response from our show last week, and I think that what we need to do, and by the way, if you want to respond, you can do so. Our comment line is 253-465-3205. I'll give it to you again. It's 253-465-3205. If we made it into a jingle, people would really remember it. You can also shoot us email, chhagetorresource.com, chhagetorresource.com. And you can leave comments on our YouTube videos. That's how we get a lot of our comments. A lot of response from last week. Let's talk about it. Basically, what happened last week is this. We talked about a book called Salvation by Allegiance Alone. Now, what this person, Bates, argues is that the word pistis, which is the Greek word translated in your English Bibles as faith, should probably, in some cases, not all, but in some cases, should actually be translated allegiance. Now, this is nothing new. Bates is not the one who actually came up with this. All he did was choose the word allegiance instead of faithfulness, because people like N.T. Wright, among others,
Right.
has already argued that the word pistis should be, in many cases, translated faithfulness, not faith. And so salvation would be by faithfulness alone. Now, what Bates did, which is innovative, is he just switched the word to allegiance. This actually fits very well into the biblical narrative of the kingdom of God, first of all, and second of all, of Yeshua being the great king. Pardon me. And so if we are thinking in terms of kingdom and the great king who is Yeshua, then all of a sudden the idea that the word pistis would actually be translated allegiance, which can be proven not only from biblical texts, but also from non-canonical literature. So if we take this into consideration, then all of a sudden this argument is actually quite strong. It's a strong argument. Well, people have not been too fond of this interpretation. However, before we jump into this, I think that there's a couple other things. So we'll leave this for our last segment because we actually do have a lot on this argument. So keep that all in mind. That's a teaser for what we're going to be talking about towards the end of the show, the second half of the show. First, let's go to Christopher. Christopher asks this. He says, when is the next Sabbath year? And should believers who keep Torah try to obey that? This is a question we get a lot. Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but the sabbatical year, which is every 70th year.
Well, there's the seventh year, and then there's the Great Jubilee.
Yes, there's the Great Jubilee, and then there's the seventh year. So I'm not sure which one he's referring to. I assume he's probably referring to the seventh year itself. And basically, this was supposed to be counted from starting the year that Israel came into the land, right? However, we don't know when that was. So that's a problem.
Well, the state of Israel, well, I think the rabbinic leaders in Israel they've instituted.
And that's the point, is that
one, right? They did their...
They instituted it from the time that Israel became a nation. But there's always been Jews in the land. There's been a presence in the land of Israelites, quote unquote Israelites, pretty much ever since Israel entered the land the first time. So do we stop counting just because Israel was in exile? That's the question.
Right, yeah.
And then the other question is it valid that they start counting from the time that Israel becomes a nation? There were farmers in Israel long before that.
And you know what? That's something I haven't researched. Farmers in Israel, what did they do, in the 15th, 16th, 17th century?
Yeah. I mean, so
I would imagine that once rabbinic authority of European Jewish communities started reaffirming the value of moving to the Holy Land, that they all got on the same page. I mean, maybe someone knows of a dispute. Oh no, that's the wrong year, between rabbinical factions, like some are saying, no, it's this year, and others are saying, no, it's another year. But
I mean, I think it is disputed whether or not we know the true Jubilee year. That's ultimately the issue, whether or not we know the true Jubilee year. Now, if we want to say that the sabbatical year starts when Israel becomes a nation, okay, fair enough, I guess. That would be up to, ask your local rabbi, I'm sure is what a lot of people in Israel would say, right? So I'm sure that there are competing ideas, whether or not God sees it as the true sabbatical year or the true, Jubilee year. That's a completely different thing as well. And so ultimately, I think the answer is we just don't know when the year is. Now to the idea of practice. Should we be keeping a sabbatical year? If we're in the land, if Christopher lives in the land, I would say yes. Israel should be those who are farming in Israel should try to give the land its due rest every 7 years, and its Jubilee year, right, every 70 years.
Yeah. Yeah. It's more of it's an effort to remember. I mean, there's no, because the whole cycle involves a tithe and involves going to the temple, right? And it involves the whole nation observing the Sabbaths. And so because it's an ongoing exile, it's going to be limited, but I think it's a good thing to remember if that's something you want to do.
Here's the thing: is that there's also the idea of what about here in America or other places outside the land. I would say that I don't think it's necessarily a commandment outside of the land. In other words, did people tithe outside of the land? Well, we have provision that if a person's too far away, that they should sell whatever their tithe is, and then use the monetary money, like what they get in money, to purchase whatever they want. And it's interesting because whatever they want is instantly tied to food or drink. And then you shall eat before the Lord, right? Anyway, so there's that.
People who are far off, yeah.
Yeah, that could be argued that it's still within the land, but it could also be argued that it's in the diaspora. Here's the other thing, though.
My point, I lean that it's only the land only, and this is why, is because in the book of Jeremiah and even at the end of Chronicles, when it's talking about the Babylonian exile, it says the land will enjoy her Sabbaths while Israel's away.
I completely agree with you. But here's the other point, is that it says in Deuteronomy, when you are in the land of your enemies, and you keep all of the commandments that are in this law today, that I'm giving you today, then I will bring you back. So obviously you can't keep the commandment of letting the land rest in the diaspora. But the question is should we make an effort to practice it in the diaspora? And ultimately this comes back to ask your local leader. This is one of the reasons that I think that it's so vitally important to be in community. You cannot follow, community is what shapes and helps us understand how to keep different laws of the Torah. And if you're not in community, then you're basically making it up yourself. The group of people is what helps shape a community's halakha, or the way that they live out the commandments. Right? All right. Let's move on. What do we got here? You look deep in study. Are you?
I was looking for something in. I was looking for something in Josephus.
I'm sorry that I'm so boring that you have to read.
No, I was it actually applied, and I'm not finding it. I'm not finding it. So it's not a big deal.
Do you want to move on, or do you want to try to find it?
Let's move on.
Okay. Anne writes in. Now this one was really a lot of fun, and I have a feeling that Rob's gonna be very vocal on this one. Okay. Anne writes in. This is a comment on our. Oh man, this is so bad. This is a comment on one of our YouTube clips, and it's a clip of us talking about the word angel. This was this last week? I think this was last week.
Or the week before, the last 2 weeks, because remember Andre said, hey, go back and drill down. And I think we came back and touched on it.
We came back and touched on it last week, and I think this is when, and she left the comment after our last video last week. So Anne writes and says, I hope I understand what you are saying regarding the historic use of the word angel as ruler. Note the following. Now, she's going to use a quote, and Rob, our local investigator, private investigator, has found the quote.
Well, it's easy to just cut and paste it into Google. And say,
I understand that, but then you did more digging and found the original quote. Hang on, we'll talk about all this in just a second.
Go ahead.
So now she's going to actually quote here. She doesn't
tell
reference.
Us who it is,
she doesn't tell us who this is or why it's important, or it gives no credence to whether or not this is even something that we should be quoting from or listening to.
Yeah, just a footnote on that too is like, so those who want to share a quote with us help you, right? Like help us, like make it easier for us to identify the sources by providing the citation. It's just good form, and it's a good practice to get in the habit of. So if you're going to email us or leave a note, with a quotation, please tell us where you got it. And otherwise we're going to try to find it. We might not be able to find it. And then if we can't find it, we're not even going to, we feel like if you don't care enough, then we're probably not going to care enough. Well, we're not going to care more about it than you.
Here's the thing: as somebody who's in a lot of, who reads a lot of articles and a lot of theological books, in my personal, and maybe I shouldn't feel like this, but when somebody writes something and makes a quote and doesn't reference where they got the quote from, it tells me that they don't want us to know where the quote is from, which ultimately says it's not a reliable quote.
It could be that, or it could be laziness. Because remember, Andre called me out on that just the other week, right? Because it was
touché, sir.
Yeah, and he was right. It was like, you know what? I was responding to a comment in the deal. It was spontaneous, and I couldn't remember. And he's like, hey, you need to give the quote. And so I went back and did it. So hey, if I'm not going to hold, we should all. It's just a good habit. It's good, and it's good for healthy thinking, right? We want to think clearly, and we want to have accuracy if possible, and precision. And so that's all we're asking.
Okay. So with that in mind,
I'm not asking somebody else to live by a standard that I'm unwilling to. Right.
With that in mind, let's read the whole thing again. Anne writes in and says, hope I understand what you are saying regarding the historic use of the word angel as ruler. Note the following, quote, the Aruch gives the reason of the name. The Chazan saith he is the angel of the church or the public minister, and the Targum renders it as one that oversees, for it is incumbent on him to oversee how the reader reads, and whom he may call out to read in the law. End quote. Anne goes on, the angel is a type of ruler in the synagogue. End comment. Okay, hang on just a second now. There's a lot to unpack here, and you probably got lost in the quote. That's totally fine. I'm going to throw this over to Rob. Rob, obliterate this, please.
Well, so the first part, she just says, I think I know what you're saying, right? She's wondering if this quotation that she shares contributes to our discussion.
I don't think that. The way that I understand her to be quoting this is that she not only buys into this quote, but she thinks that it holds some weight, because she says, I hope I understand what you were saying regarding the historic use of the word angel as ruler. Note the following. In other words, this comment should clarify to us what the word angel actually can mean. And then at the end of it, she ends her quote and says, the angel is a type of ruler in the synagogue. So she has bought into this. In other words, she believes this because of this quote.
And what it seems to, what I did is I just took a certain section of that text that looked distinguishing, and I pasted it into Google, and I came up with this book called it's called Apostolic Writings of Matithya, Netzari Emunah. And the book cover has Aramaic, and which is funny, it's from the Elephantine Aramaic papyri. So it's from 5th century BC, has nothing to do with the Gospels. It has nothing to do with the Bible, but it's on the cover. And then the lower half is like a picture from like Eastern Orthodox or Middle Eastern Christianity, iconography. And then the inside page says Apostolic Writings of Matithya, and then it has a little Paleo-Hebrew word, which I don't know what that's supposed to mean. And then it says Netzarim, and then it says Luca, which is for Luke, but it's not. It's for Matthew. So there's a lot of flags here. It says, I am the emes, ha'emes, which is Emet, so it's right. Ashkenaz. But if it's Ashkenaz, then it wouldn't be Matithya, it would be Matisya. So in other words, the person is, it's a mix. It's a strange mix. I don't think the person is self-conscious of the contradictions inherent in the effort to produce this commentary on Matthew.
This reminds me of the Et Sefer. It is a lot of wanting to do work without having the skill set being trained in a skill set to be able to work within this.
Well, and then the prayer to our Father, this says translated into first century Aramaic, which I don't know what that means, but it says, "O thou from whom breath of life comes, who fills all realms of sound, light, and vibration." I mean, like, what? Like,
It's Kabbalistic.
Well, it's not even, it's more, I don't know what it is.
It's a want to be Kabbalistic, maybe.
But the person presents this book, and the name of the book, it says Netzari Emunah, which that's not even a Hebrew. It doesn't make any sense. And the guy, there's a name, and it's a Hebrew name, Yaakov Bar Yosef. Well, I'm pretty sure that's not his name. But he's got all manner of books. They've got a Siddur. He's a Rav. It says Rav. So I would say avoid this, first of all, But the reason why I think she's citing him, because he's citing Lightfoot, he's citing a 17th or 18th century British scholar who's a Christian who studied rabbinics, who published all these commentaries. And so this Bar Yosef is citing him, but not clearly attributing it. And the reason why, because Caleb and I were talking, well, how do we know whether the lady who posted on our forum, whether she's quoting this Bar Yaakov guy or whatever, I forgot his name already, Bar Yosef, or whether she's citing Lightfoot directly. Lightfoot actually has Hebrew text in his quotation, which I was able to find. And it's not the word angel at all. So he has this is what Lightfoot says. The Aruch, which he's referring to, the Shulchan Aruch, gives the reason of the name Chazan. But see, what it is Shaliach Tzipur in Hebrew. Well, neither the lady who posted this citation nor this guy on the commentary in Matthew, it's like they edit out all the Hebrew text. So you just have a continuous English text, and you wouldn't even know that there was ever Hebrew in there in the original, because they don't cite it precisely.
This is a really good point, though, and this is a really good conversation to have to highlight one specific thing. And that is one of the things that I don't think that a pastor or a leader or even a father or anyone in a family necessarily has to go through seminary to be able to study the scriptures. Obviously, people can study the scriptures and do quite well. However, the point is that one of the things that school does do for, or at least should do for those who are trying to study the word, is give you an understanding of what a good source is, and why and how to ask good questions, and then also how to pick out why we would use this as a source. In other words, when I don't have to use primary sources when I'm going to quote something, right? And if I'm writing my Acts commentary or whatever, and I find a quote from a modern day scholar like Darrell Bach. Well, Darrell Bach, I disagree with him on a lot of things, but he's written a very extensive commentary on Acts. And so I can use him I can quote him because he's done a lot of work in the field. That doesn't mean he's necessarily right, but I can quote him. Something like this is ridiculous because the person who wrote this, who literally plagiarized this quote and didn't give reference to the 17th century Lightfoot who originally said it.
Right.
They're mishandling the quote, first of all, because now they've taken out Hebrew, right? And they don't know what in the world they're talking about. And so now this other person who is now commenting on our YouTube video,
they're just passing on the problem.
They're
replicating the.
Well, what they've done is they've gone and they've found something that they think sounds really good, and there's not enough ability to discern one way or the other whether or not this is a decent quote or not. From their quoting it and their comments around it, it just sounds like they've bought it hook, line, and sinker. And this is a major problem. And this is one of the reasons I think that within the Torah movement, you have these different splinter groups that have really gone into some wackadoo, theological stances, and they're not helpful at all.
If you want to add glitter to that glue you're sniffing, that's fine, but don't dump your wackadoo all over us.
Okay, keep going, Rob.
So what we have then is this issue of citation. Now, to be absolutely fair, two things. One is he does have a list at the one of the initial pages, and Lightfoot is mentioned in a whole stack of lists, but he doesn't later on a page like this is what I'm citing. And what I don't know is did he get Lightfoot's quote from someone else who removed the Hebrew? So did he remove it or not? I guess I don't know for sure, but she's replicating a problem. And maybe she doesn't know to research that. But the point is, what Lightfoot put is, he says the person was called Shaliach Tzibur, and then he translates that, the angel of the church. Well, Shaliach does not mean angel. It means more like apostle. Right. It's a sent one. It's one sent. Now, does a Shaliach, can it serve as a messenger and like reverse translation as Malach? Maybe. Tzibur means the public. That doesn't mean church. And then a Chazan HaKnesset, that's what he says, the Chazan or the bishop of the congregation. So, and then again, Shaliach Tzibur is translated as the angel of the church, and then, or public minister in quotes or in brackets. The whole point is, here you have a British educated, this is in the 1700s, has limited access to rabbinics, and he's trying to make sense of it. He's trying to use rabbinic literature, it looks like the Shulchan Aruch, which is composed in 16th century Safed, basically, right, and projecting that as, these rules go all the way back to Yeshua's day and are therefore provide the cultural and religious ritual context for understanding the scriptures. Why else would the guy put it in a commentary to Matthew, right? So that's just a big problem. That's a big problem. So I hope that, do you say Anne? I hope she hears this, not, in a constructive way. A, cite your source. B, if you're listening to this Bar Yaakov or Bar Yosef guy, I would just say,
stop.
I would say, yeah, stop that. Don't.
I guess
what I call it, this is folk messianism. Folk messianism, and what that means is this is the same as the Et Sefer, like you were saying. This is the same as the Matz guy, Messianic Aleph Tav. Anybody who does Hebrew word pictures, or the lunar Sabbath people, or this is folk messianism. In other words, it's people who have a Strong's Concordance and the internet, and they dive in and they spend a year in their own echo chamber. And then they start writing books and say, and leading other people.
I guess the end all point, religion. The end all point here is that the quote that you have given says nothing literally speaks nothing into into our conversation.
Right. Yeah, there's no relevance whatsoever.
Yeah.
Yeah. The only the thread of connection that was imagined was Lightfoot's translation of Shaliach from the Shulchan Aruch into angel of the church.
Right.
It's an equivalency that he's insisting on. And then, of course, whenever you make an equivalency, you can imagine all sorts of ramifications.
Right.
Yeah. But the point is, like, which ones of these are profitable and fruitful, and which ones are dead ends, and actually, or even dangerous because they undermine where the real life is, So.
Okay, give us a call, 253-465-3205, 253-465-3205. That's just an answering machine. You can call up and yell at us and tell us how wrong we are, or whatever you want to do. You can also shoot us email, chegg@torahresource.com. It's chegg@torahresource.com. Okay, let's move on. So, as I have already tried to set up at the beginning of the show, last week we talked about this book, Salvation by Allegiance Alone, by Bates. And Stephen and Tracy, they left a comment. And let's start with this, and then we'll go through to Laura and her email. Laura wrote quite a lengthy email, and I don't think we'll be able to touch on the whole thing. I actually only pulled out two things, 3 paragraphs, 2 points. I don't know if you pulled out more. But let's start with Stephen and Tracy. They wrote in and said, would not sola fide, and for those who don't know, this is one of the 5 solas, by faith alone, fall into this as well? The 5 solas speak nothing about works. How would you reconcile the famed Reformed stance on this issue? This is a good question. However, I think that there's multiple things going on here. First of all, the idea of by allegiance alone does not contradict the idea of the 5 solas. In other words, what is they didn't, for instance, the 5 solas did not come about in English. So obviously it's in Latin. Sola fide is a Latin term. They're using the Latin Vulgate to try to understand and interpret the Bible. And so when they say sola fide is the translation of this word pistis. So the real question goes back to, what does the word fide and or pistis actually mean? And so this would actually work just fine, because what we could say is sola fide, meaning by allegiance alone. Now, what I did, and I will pass this over to you in just a few seconds here, I wanted to look at the idea of, and we've talked on this show before about, the book of James, which Martin Luther said was a right strawy book, in other words, a book made of straw. Why did he say that? Well, he had a lot of hardship trying to reconcile this idea of faith alone, and then also passages in James, like in James 4, where he says, therefore you know that works save you. Or that works justify you. Is it save you or justify? I think it's justify, actually.
No, justified by works.
Yeah. And so he had a real hard time trying to reconcile these two passages. Now, I think that within Scripture obviously interprets Scripture, and I think that in Galatians, Paul gives us a very good explanation of this when he references Abraham and the fact that Abraham believed and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And this was before he got circumcised. In other words, faith preceded works. And I would even...
It's James 2.
James 2. I'm sorry. I said 4. It's James 2. And I would even say that we could possibly use the word allegiance here as well. In other words, allegiance precedes works. Abraham gave his allegiance, gave his faith, placed his faith in the coming seed, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. This was before any works happened. Now, how we see this played out within Reformed theology is justification, and then comes sanctification. And Martin Luther actually talks about this. This is a quote from Martin Luther. He says, justification and sanctification are related like cause and effect. And from the presence of the effect, we may conclude that the cause is at work. Well, this is exactly right. In other words, my works aren't going to prove that I have something that I don't actually have before I have it. If I give full faith and or / allegiance to God, I give my allegiance first, and then the works come after it. And so justification followed by sanctification work hand in hand, but sanctification is always going to come after the justification.
Right. It's a tree and fruit. It's a tree and fruit. Paul's point in Romans 11, for example, how is it that the branches remain attached
right
to the trunk? By faith. Faith is the juice that holds it together. And then the fruit comes out. The branches that aren't fruitful, what happens? Lopped off and thrown into the fire, right? I mean, that's
one of the reasons that I see allegiance to be such a helpful term is because we see allegiance as faith working first, and then the sanctification as the evidence of that allegiance. In other words, if I say that I have allegiance to a king, but then I continue to try to mount a coup against that king, or I continue to do things that he against what he has commanded, I continue to fight him. I continue to go against him. What does that mean? I haven't made true allegiance to him. The allegiance that I gave was by mouth only. It's action that proves the allegiance. That's the point.
I love this. I love this in Luke 5. There's the man who's the paralytic, and I think there's 4 guys trying to bring him in, and they can't get into Yeshua. They're trying to get in through the crowd. Right. So what do? They go up. They go up onto the roof
and lower him through. Yeah,
break through the roof, and they lower him down on the stretcher. And what is it? It says in Luke 5:20, seeing their faith, seeing their pistis, he said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." Seeing their pistis.
Right.
That's a perfect example. That's a perfect example. Their faith, they were bound and determined to get next to Yeshua, and they persevered through different obstacles to the point where they did something that was socially totally unconventional.
Right.
Unconventional. Like, you're going to break through someone's house, like the roof. Like, it was like, doesn't matter. We're getting our buddy in front of Yeshua. You know what I mean? It's like, that was it.
Right.
And Yeshua, it must have been genuine faith, because it says Yeshua saw it.
Right.
Like, if it wasn't real, if they were hypocrites, Yeshua would have seen hypocrisy.
I think that the ultimate point here is that even within the reformers believed in sanctification fully. I think even more than people today in many ways. In other words, the life that was lived unto God was a stringent life of holiness. And people were, if we look at cultural, even then, the cultural norms back then, they seem to be dictated more by a allegiance to Christ in many cases over what we would see today in the church, I should say, in the church. And so the idea that we have to separate any kind of works from, and when I say works, I mean sanctification. Any kind of sanctification, we have to just take that out of the equation totally. That's not what sola fide means. Sola fide is meaning that we are justified because of something that God has done. And I totally agree with that. Faith is a gift. God calls us to him, and he gives us faith. That's a gift, and that is what justifies us. Works are the fruit of that prove that the faith was true. And how can we wrap that all up into one word? Allegiance. That's why I think that the term is helpful, personally.
Right. And here's just one other point that I wanted to make that pertain to the email. And I'm grateful, for the question that brought us to look at the book a couple of weeks ago, and then also, or last week, whenever it was, and then the follow-up is that when you look at James's citation, he gives 2 examples of what he says justification by works. He gives Abraham and Rahab. For Abraham, he talks about the offering of Isaac, what we learn about in Genesis 22. And for Rahab, it's hiding the spies in Jericho, in the walls or in the roof of Jericho, at the conquering, in the days of Joshua. And that's in the beginning of the book of Joshua. And he says, see, their faith produced works. It wasn't just an idea. It was something they actually changed their behavior. They behaved according to it. They were all in. And that is reckoned as righteousness, is what they were. They're justified by their works. And it's important to remember that both the offering of Isaac and Rahab hiding the spies are in the bigger list of Hebrews 11.
Right.
Where it says, by faith, Abraham did this. By faith, Abraham offered Isaac. By faith, Rahab hid the spies. In other words, James is just picking 2 of the things that are already called by faith in Hebrews 11, and he's unpacking them, saying, look, you can't separate works from faith.
Right.
Now, here's where the snag is, and this might be the problem that Luther had between reconciling the language we find in James from the language we find in Paul. Paul uses the word works of the law and says you're not justified by works. What Paul means by works he's not talking about things like the Akedah or the hiding of the spies or anything that has to do with obedience to God. Paul would say, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Jewish community rules that are man-made, that people says you need to be one of us or you're not righteous, or you're not really a son of Abraham unless you adopt this halakha over against that halakha. In the nature of first century Jewish sectarianism, what Paul is trying to use works in those, talking about that world, because that's the word used in Qumran. I think that just makes the best sense. They called it works, and we see it. It's used later in the rabbinic material. Paul's talking about Jewish sectarianism that says insider, outsider, based on man-made rules, traditions of men, and Jews judging other Jews because of man-made rules.
Okay,
and that's the difference between Paul and James.
I completely agree with you. We could also talk about the word dogma that is used twice. Paul uses the word dogma as well. But the point is, one of the points that needs to be made very quickly is that I don't believe, and Rob does not believe, that we can do anything to gain our salvation. There's no work that I can do that's going to make God love me more. We are not
or make you more righteous.
Yeah, we are not justified by the works that we do, or by keeping the Torah, or by Sabbath observance, or anything like that. So please don't hear us say that you can earn your salvation in some way. That is not what we are saying. And if that's what you think that we're saying, you need to go back and listen again. Okay, let's move on to this email that was given. I have 2 points, 3 paragraphs that I want to address here. So this is by Lauren. She wrote us an email. She says, my concern, and this is in response to our talking about this very subject. She says, my concern, I don't happen to think that salvation is by allegiance, or that final salvation is based on a person's continued allegiance. These ideas can lead to the belief that salvation is by works. I also think he's being too novel with the idea that pistis should be translated as allegiance. Okay. Let's stop.
Back to Bates, referring to Matthew Bates' book.
Yeah, back to Bates' book. First of all, when I read Bates's 4th chapter, it's very clear that what he's saying, that the examples that he gives are not only in non-canonical literature, but also within Scripture. There are times that the word pistis is clearly a reference to allegiance. Clearly. And I don't think so. The comment that I also think he's being too novel with the idea that pistis should be translated as allegiance. I'm sorry, the evidence is weighed against you, heavily weighed against you, because there are obviously times where the word pistis does mean allegiance, both biblically and non-biblically. So he's not being novel in this. He takes instances where it clearly means allegiance. That's what this word can mean. If you look up in a dictionary, you have multiple different translations of what a word can mean. Pistis, one of the translations can be faith, and one of them can be allegiance, among other things. But this is not a novel idea that Bates is putting forward. So right there we're starting off a little bit not quite on the right foot.
But he does know to say salvation by allegiance alone. Admittedly, he's trying to create a catchy title, right? Because he's using,
of course,
sola fide and say, I'm going to kind of poke right where it hurts there.
Well, I mean, it's a brilliant title because people say, wait, what?
And then they'll at least pick it up. And
they'll at least pick it up.
Cover, right, yeah.
So, but the point is that he's not trying to force this word to mean something that it doesn't mean. The meaning is already, the meaning already has this word. In other words, faith and allegiance are both translations of this word. All he's doing is taking the translation of allegiance and placing it into specific verses within the Bible. Now, here's the thing. In her first comment, she says, I don't happen to think that salvation by allegiance or that final salvation is based on the person's continued allegiance. Okay, stop right there. Let's talk about this for a second. The thing is that For me, what we need to do is look at the Bible. In other words, it doesn't matter how I feel about the idea that pistis can mean allegiance. Let's look at the Bible and see what the context actually says. And then we'll work from the Bible outwards. My personal conviction and or my personal thought on what the Bible should say, and she's going to actually reference this below, has nothing to do with whether or not the Bible actually says something or not. What we need to do is look at what the Bible actually says, what the intention of the author was, and what the words that the author uses are intended to mean. And then from there, we can try to figure out what that means for our doctrine and so on. So the idea that this might be, sketchy or whatever, well, the question is not whether or not it's sketchy theology. The question is, does the Bible actually use it this way? And the answer is, yeah, it does. So now we have to actually reconcile that with the Bible. And I don't think that it's a problem. I don't think that I don't think that there is any problem in translating it this way. She goes on. Do you want to stop and say anything about that before we move on?
Go ahead.
Okay. Towards the end of the email, she says this. She says, and then I'll pass this over to you. I don't know if you have the email in front of you. I'm sure that there's things you want to talk about. She says, Caleb seemed to agree with Bates's translation of Romans 3. But in addition to Bates's repurposed version of the passage, I don't think it's repurposed. I think that what Bates is trying to do is say, can we use the term allegiance here? And would this make more sense than faith? So I don't think that's repurposed. I think he's asking a genuine question about the language itself. But she says, Caleb exchanged the preposition of with to. And then she quotes me, the righteousness of God through the allegiance of Jesus the Christ, or should it be to Jesus Christ for all who give allegiance? End quote of me. Now back to Laura. She says, if we translate words to match our preferred theology, that translation becomes an interpretation. Okay, let's stop right there for a second. The reason that I said, or should it be to, is because the Greek is ambiguous. So this is not me trying to retranslate something into a preferred theology. I'm trying to be honest with the text, something that your English translation does not do. You don't know from the English translation whether or not it should be to or of. So before we make allegations that I am attempting to change words to translate something according to my preferred theology, please stop for a second and do a little research. The reason I stopped and made the or should it be to is because this is what the Greek could be. This has nothing to do with my preferred interpretation. I don't have a dog in the race when it comes to Bates and his book. What I'm trying to figure out is whether or not this is a good translation or not. She goes on, don't you think that we sometimes have to wrestle with an ambiguous / difficult, yet properly translated text? I absolutely do, which is why this is why we're wrestling with this text. And this is why I said, or should it be to? She goes on, we shouldn't change it to make it fit our interpretation. I completely agree with you. So which one are you going to take? To Laura, my question would be, okay, we shouldn't change it. So are you going to take of or to in that passage according to the Greek translation? And how are you going to parse that? That's what I think Bates is doing. He jumps from faith to faithfulness and finally lands on the novel allegiance. You can think that, but the Greek itself would disagree with you. Okay, I'm done. Go ahead, Rob. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I want to just throw a different verse into here from Romans.
Okay.
Romans 15:8 says, for I say that Christ, Messiah, became a servant of the circumcision on behalf of the truth of God to confirm the promises to the fathers, for the Gentiles to glorify God for his mercy. And then as it is written, and it has a bunch of Bible citations. This for me, even though the word pistis is not used in this particular verse, Romans 15:8, this is describing Yeshua's faithfulness. Yeshua came and did precisely what the mission was. He didn't come up short. He didn't do too much. He didn't do too little. He did it precise obedience to the Father. And that is that, in my view, let me go back to our Romans 2 passage. It's Romans 2, right, that we're looking at?
Romans 3 is what Laura references Romans 3.
So faith is used a couple different times in this Romans 2 and Romans 3. So there's times where faithfulness, in my view, the faithfulness of Yeshua is an acceptable way to understand it. But allegiance to Yeshua and Yeshua's own faithfulness to fulfilling the promises are inextricable, right? They're of the same stuff. We don't have independent life, right? If we're died and with Messiah and we're risen with him, then it's his resurrection life that we benefit from. Just like Paul writes that in Galatians 2. It's not, he says, well, I live, but it's not really me. It's Messiah who lives in me. Well, what's the Messiah? What's he's talking about? Messiah living in him. That's Yeshua's resurrection life, which is composed of Yeshua's faithfulness and the gift of, if you want to call it faith in him or allegiance to him. I think those are both acceptable, but I think Caleb and I are both in agreement that allegiance provides a little bit of beef, right? A little bit of highlight, and adds a little gravity to the side of that. Obedience is expected, right? I mean, in other words, it looks like something. Genuine faith produces the fruits of the Spirit, produces obedience to God. And so when we're talking about salvation by allegiance, I think of the way I hear that is not salvation by works in a negative way. I hear it salvation by fruit producing faith.
Right. And one of the reasons that I think that the term allegiance is actually very attractive throughout the biblical narrative is because, and this might sound like a rabbit trail, but give me just a few seconds on this. Within biblical scholarship, Meredith Klein, Dr. Daniel Block, others have talked a lot about, and even my father wrote his master's thesis on covenant of grant. And what all three of these different scholars have done is they've talked about suzerain vassal treaties. Now, in our modern time, we have people who deny Trinitarian theology and or the deity of the Messiah and try to say, oh, it's because Yeshua is an agent of the Father. And so this gets into the Arian view of agent theology. And basically what this, I'll bring this back in just a second, but basically what this does is it says that the 14th, 15th century BCE documents of the suzerain vassal treaties actually is what God modeled the first covenant with Israel after, and then the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, so whether or not we believe that or not, there is good evidence that that Deuteronomy actually follows the structure of a suzerain vassal treaty. And what the suzerain vassal treaty was, a suzerain would come in, he'd take over land, and then he'd put up a vassal. This was like an underling that would rule in his stead while he wasn't there.
A local leader.
Local leader. And what those who deny the Trinity and those who deny the deity of the Messiah have tried to say is, oh, see, look, Yeshua is the vassal, and the Father is the suzerain. So Yeshua is he's just an underling. He's not really God. He's not really Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. But he's given the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh because he has that amount of power over this earth. The problem with this is that throughout the scriptures, and Dr. Chris Tilling shows this very well in his book called Paul's Divine Christology. What the problem with this is that the Bible does not set Yeshua up as the vassal. It sets Israel up as the vassal, and it shows that Yeshua is the suzerain. He's the great king. And so when we bring in this word pistis...
Right, he's the one that goes away and leaves people in charge, right?
Right, Israel. Right? Israel's in charge to try to take the Torah to the nations and show the kingdom of God. and implement the kingdom of God on earth. But then what happens? The vassal comes back and he rules. He rules the land and the entire world. And the point is that when we all of a sudden think of in terms of this, which I think that the Bible it talks about this quite a lot, and Yeshua being this suzerain king, this great king. When we think about this and then we use the word allegiance, all of a sudden we bring the word allegiance, the English word allegiance in, and say that actually this has been in the Bible the whole time, and that the word pistis can mean allegiance. It actually does fit very well with the theme of the Bible that Yeshua is in fact this vassal king that is coming to rule.
Well, this ties in with pistis, and I don't remember if Bates cites this, but in Luke 18:8, and it says, "When the Son of Man comes, will he find pistis on the earth?"
Right.
To me, are we going to call that faith? I mean, translations like the NASB, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Well, okay, but could it mean allegiance? Will he find people who have held their post? Right? Will he find servants that are ready to receive him and saying, "We've been waiting, here you go, come on in," etc.? Or are you going to find servants that that are drunk and beating each other and eating all the storehouse?
Right. So yeah, this was actually when I don't know how many people saw the debate that I did with Sean on Growing in Messiah, but this was one of the real frustrating points for me, is that he brought up like servant, servitude from Yeshua to the Father. He brought up this concept, and I tried to bring up the suzerain vassal treaties. He had no clue what I was talking about. And so, he's able to try to work within his own structure anyway. That was very frustrating. The point is that I think that the word allegiance actually, and it is not necessarily whether or not this works in English, because that's not the question that I'm trying to ask.
Exactly.
The question is,
we're not suggesting changing the Greek text.
Yeah, the question is when a Greek-speaking person in the first century hears the word pistis, what are they thinking? What does this bring to mind? And I think that very possibly allegiance was one of the things that it often brought to mind. I absolutely agree. And faithfulness and faith. Somebody asked in the chat room, what's the difference between faith and allegiance? It's a great question. And I think that especially in the first century, these terms, the way that we use them in English, we go to one of these three ideas or concepts. But the point is that in the first century, that's not what happened. It was kind of a mingling of all. And so that's
another passage. I think Bates does cite this, like in Luke 6. "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I say?"
Right.
So in other words, there's
yes.
the lordship of Yeshua there's expectations. It looks like something. It has shape. It has form. There are boundaries. There are deal breakers, right? I mean, it's covenant shaped life. And
well, clearly faith clearly faith cannot simply mean belief. The demons know of Christ, they know of God the Father,
right?
And they tremble, and they certainly believe that He's there. I mean, that's not faith,
right? That's not saving faith,
exactly,
right? So it's a good discussion, and the very fact that people wonder about, well, how do I reconcile James with Paul, means that even in the first century, these words had nuance that they needed to clarify. And so, as we know, words don't have meaning. Meaning has words.
Exactly. It's been a good conversation, all. We really appreciate all of the even if you guys disagree, whoever it is out there, if you're thinking to yourself, man, I so disagree with these guys, I can't stand these guys.
Or you think that commentary is the greatest thing.
Yeah, exactly. It does. I mean, we base this show around what comments and criticisms and all those kind of things we get, because basically what we're trying to do in this show is just talk about different theological concepts and whatnot. Obviously, we're going to present what we believe.
Sure. And we desire to be helpful to you in your own studies.
Right. So with all of that said, please keep the comments coming, keep the emails coming, keep the phone messages coming. I listen to every single phone message that comes in. I send most of them to Rob as well. We read every email that comes in, and we read pretty much every YouTube comment that comes in as well. So we appreciate it. Keep them coming. And I don't know what in the world we're talking about next week, but I think that next week we will be back for another show. And we hope.
And I think we had a Messiah Matters More this week. We
did. There's a Messiah Matters More video up in the supporters area. Go check it out. It was done on the fly, and usually we're doing these videos now on Mondays or Tuesdays, so they're usually out right like the day before our show. So for our supporters, check those out. All right. We hope that this conversation has glorified our great God and Savior, Yeshua the Messiah. Why? Well, because Messiah matters.